In this video, we're going to take an in-depth look at the setup area of the program. On the Administration tab, you'll find the Setup button. Click the Setup button to enter the Setup menu. Depending upon the access level you've been granted to the program, your screen may look slightly different as you may not have all the options available to you on the screen. This is the default screen for the administrator. You will notice multiple tabs from location to email settings, labor settings, color options, users and permissions, program options, and then administrative options and SQL settings, which are reserved for the administrator. We will discuss all of the tabs except the administrative options and SQL settings, which are discussed in a separate video. First, you'll notice the Location tab. Before you can enter any information into any other tab, you must complete the setup of the Location tab. Most of the fields are self-explanatory. Notice, however, here I have not set up yet a telephone number. I would highly encourage you to set up a telephone number for your restaurant, as this information is used in some of the reports and some of the texts that are sent to employees. Also, select the state you're doing business in. You can optionally also choose to add a logo to the program by providing a logo file. The logo would show up in the upper left-hand corner of the program as well as all of the reports. Once you've made the changes on the Location tab, you must click Accept so that the changes can be saved. Once those changes have been saved, and this is the first time you've used this program, your other tabs will then become available to you. Let's look at the Email Settings tab. The program can send emails to employees as well as texts. Until you have completed the setup in this page, you will not be able to email or text employees or email the schedule to your supervisor or others. If you need help with these settings, you should consult with your supervisor on the correct settings for this tab. The Labor Settings tab is where you set up information about labor as well as other areas of the program. Here you can see that there are multiple types of labor that can be utilized in the program, either a labor chart in fixed dollars, or a variable labor percent in fixed manager dollars. If you use a labor chart, you can enter a specific labor chart provided by your company by clicking the Import Chart button and browsing to the file that contains your labor chart. The labor chart generator is included with the program, but is a separate function outside of this program. Other fields on this tab include hours tracking. Here you select the minimum job code for hours not to count on the schedule. Perhaps your labor chart does not include assistant managers, so therefore you would not want to include assistant managers in your hours tracking as it relates to your payroll chart. Hours for closing is a field where you tell the program how long it takes for you to close your store. When you schedule someone to closing time, that doesn't mean they clock out at closing time and go home. If they're scheduled to close, that usually means that they will also be there to clean up. Depending upon your store, it may take less time or more time. The default time is 1 hour. This 1 hour is then added to the employee time. You can change this. It has a range of 0 all the way to 3 hours. The default again is 1. If you watched our video on the Data Manager, you remember that the first date of review was 6 months after the hire date. This is where you indicate this. You can set this anywhere from 1 month to 12 months. The program will automatically populate the report that deals with employee reviews based upon what's set here. Some states allow for minor minimum wage. If that applies to you, you can fill out the information as provided here. Here's where you set whether or not your restaurant pays for breaks. You can select either yes or no. If you select no paid breaks, you also have the option of minimum hours before unpaid break, and you can set that anywhere from 2 hours all the way to 8 hours. You can also set what the length of the unpaid break is in minutes, as well as an exemption, an automatic exemption for unpaid breaks. If your store's policy or your company's policy is that we pay for breaks for any assistant manager and hire automatically, then select the appropriate job code here. Two other areas that we have are called tracking areas. We can track peak period staffing. We've discussed before these tracking areas at the top of the schedule, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Well, here is where we define this. We can define it for weekdays, and we can define it for weekends. What we're defining is a starting time and an ending time, and a percentage of that time the employee must work in order to be counted as that particular day part worker. In this particular example, our starting time is 7 a.m., our ending time is 9 a.m., and our percentage is 50%. What this is saying is that during this 2-hour time window of 7 a.m. to 9 a.m., any employee that works within that window of 50% of that time, or 1 hour, would be counted as a breakfast person. If an employee starts at 8 and works until 2, they qualify as 8 to 9 is 1 hour and falls within that 2-hour time window. If an employee were to start at 8:30 and work until 2, he would not be counted, as he was only working 30 minutes within that 2-hour time window of that particular breakfast day part. However, he would be counted, or she would be counted, as a lunch worker, since lunch is from 11 to 1, and this employee works until 2, therefore covering the entire lunch period. You can define these day parts as you wish by clicking the arrows below the time slots. The program will track weekend breakfast, lunch, and dinner separately. The reason for this is on weekends, breakfast, lunch, and dinner may start later, and you may wish to track workers later. The percentages can also be changed on both weekday and weekend from 100 all the way down to 25%. The last area on the labor settings is the minimum staffing levels. Here you can define 3 time windows and the number of employees that you wish to have on the schedule at any given time. This will alert you during the auditor if you have fallen below the minimum number of employees during this time window. Let's now look at the next tab, Color Options. The program allows for various color combinations. If you're bored with the default color option, you have 6 other choices to choose from. The next tab is the Users tab. The program comes with a primary user by default. The primary user is generally the general manager of the restaurant. Carried over from older versions of the software, the primary user was called Primary. When you first start this program, you will have a primary user called Primary as the default user. You can edit this user at any time. In newer versions, such as this version, you can now change the name of this primary user to something actually more meaningful. You can also set up 8 additional secondary users. Perhaps you have an assistant manager or a shift supervisor who you have entrusted to work on the work schedule. Therefore, you can give them their own access with their own set of permissions. Let's go ahead now and add another user. I'll add Sally as my secondary user. And I'll give her a password. Sally has now been saved with a default set of permissions. You can make permission changes for this user in the Permissions tab, which is what we will look at next. Let's go over to the Permissions tab. You notice a grid, and this grid contains permissions assigned to each of the users of the program. If you follow the gray lines, you can read about which permission these lines point to. For instance here, employee data, add new hire. Mike has permission because the box is checked, as does Sally. You can follow each of these around to see each permission involved on this tab. Over on the right-hand side is the category. There are 3 categories of permissions. Permissions relating to the data manager, permissions relating to the Setup tab, which is this tab, and other permissions. Let's move over to the Setup tab. You will see that there are some new permissions now. These deal with the user's access to various tabs on the Setup menu. You can see the primary user, Mike, has access to more tabs than Sally, the secondary user. Mike can allow Sally to have access to other things, such as labor options. If I want Sally to have access to labor options, I click the box under Labor Options next to Sally. Sally now has access to labor options. If I do not want Sally to have access to anything on the Setup tab, I click this No Access button. Clicking No Access will gray out the Setup button for Sally when she logs in with her user account. Finally, the Other Options tab deals with sensitive data and wages and wage changes. By default, Sally has no access to this. So if Sally is logged in and tries to print a report with wage information or tries to change information about wages, she will be greeted with a nice message saying that she does not have access to this information. So here is where you set permissions for users of the program. The next tab is Program Options. There are numerous program options that you can set to change the way the program operates. Remember the real-time flags we discussed in one of the earlier videos? These are the little flags here that indicate that you have violated an employee availability profile. You can choose not to show that. However, I would strongly encourage you to always show these. If you were to click this box, those icons would not show. However, the auditor would always catch those violations. You also have an option to change this to flags instead of stoplights. Notice how this has changed now to a flag instead of a stoplight. You also notice that these are red or yellow. Red would indicate this has to do with a minor employee, where yellow would indicate an employee 16 years or older. You can also choose to change the color of the training symbols from black, blue, or red, and you can also turn them off altogether. When finished in the Setup menu, click Close. That completes our detailed look at the Setup menu.